I'm a member of the Energy Institute's Council and I chair the UKERC Research Committee. This morning, I'm going to be joined by Rob Gross, the UKERC Director and a Professor at Imperial College London, Mike Thompson, who's the Director of Analysis at the Climate Change Committee, Antony Froggatt, Senior Research Fellow and Deputy Director of the Environment and Society Programme at Chatham House, Elizabeth Blakelock, who's Principal Policy Manager at Citizens Advice, and Juliet Phillips, Senior Policy Advisor at E3G. I'm going to be asking Rob, Mike and Antony to give us their thoughts first. Rob's going to focus on price, Mike on emissions and Antony on what's going on in Europe. After we've heard from those three speakers, I'm going to give us a 5-minute comfort break so that we can all just refresh ourselves. And then I'm going to be asking Elizabeth and Juliet to reflect on what they've just heard. We're then going to have a decent amount of time for a panel discussion and to answer your questions. So can I please encourage you to post questions in the Q&A throughout the session, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. So this is the second joint webinar on the energy crisis that UKERC, the EI and the Royal Academy of Engineering have delivered. The first of them was over 5 months ago at the end of May. And so before turning to our speakers, I'd just like to take a few minutes to reflect on where we were back then, what we were talking about and what we expected or hoped might happen between now and then also think about what's actually happened. So back in late May, we had a windfall tax on the table. We had oil and gas producers warning that maybe it would do harm to their industry. Energy companies like SSE were announcing 15% increase in year-on-year profits, and the government had on the table the option of keeping open coal plants at their normal capacity to ease supply constraints over the winter. The energy price cap for households was at around £2,000 for average bills then. That was already £700 more than it had been prior to the April increase. And Ofgem had just announced a further planned increase of 80% for October, which would have increased average bills to over £3,500. So as Jan Webb, chair of the last webinar, said at the time, we were all expecting to see exceptional numbers of people in fuel poverty this winter. So at that webinar, we all acknowledged that time was short and that we could only do a limited amount to help people reduce their bills by offering them additional energy efficiency measures for their homes. So we said, well, what else do we need to do? We talked about the need for personal action. We talked about the need for those of us who use more energy than we actually need to make changes to our behaviour that would reduce fuel use. We talked about the need for community action, the need to help those who can't afford the fuel they need, and whether that be through community warm spaces and the provision of hot food, or provision of targeted advice and also the equipment that people would need to make good use of that advice. We thought about industry action, the need for energy companies to help their customers and also to help the communities within which they were situated. And alongside this, we heard about UKERC work that showed how wholesale energy market reform to make prices more cost reflective could save everybody money on their energy bills. And we heard from the International Energy Agency about their ideas for concerted communal action across Europe. So we also thought about what government could and should do. And that included providing additional financial help to those who needed it most, coordinating a major campaign over the summer to ensure that we all knew how to save energy when and where we could safely do so. We talked about ensuring that existing schemes to provide energy efficiency retrofit were able to deliver absolutely as much as possible before this winter to those most in need. So what's happened between then and now then? Well, a lot can change in 5 months, but it can also stay frustratingly the same in some ways. So during a period of, I suppose, what we can only call turmoil politically, there have been some positive changes. So the government introduced the energy price guarantee, which is restraining average energy bills this winter to £2,500. And there have been direct payments towards this for all households and some additional payments for those most in need. Support for businesses is also available. But that doesn't alter the fact that bills remain unaffordable for many households, particularly in the context of high inflation in things like food prices as well. And the help for households isn't as well targeted as ideally it would have been. On the 17th of October, the Chancellor announced that the energy price guarantee and business support would only last for 6 months in its current form. Now, that might be good news if it means that financial help will be next year will be more targeted and that there'll be a greater focus on energy efficiency, which I think is the plan. But nonetheless, it is still more uncertainty for already stressed people. Sadly, energy efficiency schemes have not been a focus for government over the summer, so we haven't got as much help to people as perhaps we could have done. We've got a government that changes its mind about high-profile energy security issues. I'll just say fracking as one example. Well, I mean, we've got a government that changes, doesn't just change its mind. So that introduces uncertainty and therefore risk. If we look to the continent, we have European countries as a bloc and also individually that continue to focus on how to encourage a communal response and reducing energy use. But we seem to have a UK government that refuses to do this. Although I have to note that this morning I read that the Scottish government has now launched its public energy agency, which will have a focus on energy advice to start with in terms of energy efficiency and managing demand. So that's good to hear. And then we've got National Grid preparing to incentivise customers to shift demand away from peak times to avoid potential supply shortages. So where are we at right now? Maybe the situation isn't as bad as it was looking back in May. We have had some positive action. There's more financial support for energy consumers, but there are still very many people who won't be able to afford basic energy services this winter, and many businesses that will struggle to stay afloat. And we must acknowledge that we've missed opportunities to become more resilient through as much energy efficiency investment as possible in the short time frame we had, and through communal efforts to reduce energy demand. So we do need to take this opportunity to refocus on the immediate future and think again about what the implications of the crisis now are and what we can still do about it. So that's what we're doing here this morning. And with that, I'm going to invite our speakers to give us their thoughts. So first of all, I'd like to hand over to Rob.
Hello, everybody, and thanks very much for that introduction, Joanne. I just asked Joanne for a quick thumbs up to make sure that my audio is coming through okay. Great stuff. You'll be pleased to know, hopefully, that I don't have slides. And what I've got to say really is contextualization for the guests that we've invited, that I'm very pleased to have given up their time this morning. And there is a bit of overlap. Some of what I'm going to say is along similar lines to what Joanne was just saying. My brief is to kind of think about the impact on consumers and prices over the coming winter. And I'm going to do that by reflecting on the wider policy context and some of the kind of initiatives and developments that are taking place in this country. I'll touch on some of the things that are happening overseas, but I'll leave the detail on the response in other parts of Europe to Antony. So we have the pre-existing price cap arrangements, which is obviously a downstream retail market intervention, the purpose of which, just to remind everyone, was originally to protect the non-switching consumers from what was seen at the time as being ripped off by suppliers. So it was never intended to provide the wherewithal to protect consumers against unprecedented events in the wider world geopolitically, and because it's a downstream intervention, in the absence of fiscal flows through from government, which obviously is what's now happening, it doesn't have the capacity to protect consumers without bankrupting suppliers. I mean, that's the kind of basic mechanics of the price cap arrangements that we had, but we still have, and that were in place, and which caused the car crash that we saw last winter, when not well hedged and not well capitalized suppliers, and we can have a conversation, that conversation is happening now with Ofgem and others, whether or not those suppliers should ever have been allowed to exist, went bust. And then overlaying the existing arrangements, we now have the energy price guarantee that the the one Prime Minister ago was announced only a few weeks ago, that sets the current cap at £2,500. Still a doubling, as Joanne mentioned, on what bills were like before. For the average house, now it's really worth stressing, it's not a price cap of £2,500 for every household. It is a cap on the price per unit of energy. And what's different from the arrangements that were in place previously is that the wider tax burden, the wider borrowing and taxpayers will underwrite that guarantee. Now that's on top of the £400 rebate that was already being paid through suppliers, again paid for through general taxation. So both of these are paid by taxpayers, either directly or through borrowing. And as we saw, I think there was a sense macroeconomically that pervaded right through COVID and prior to that, perhaps back to the start of this government, that money was for free, that governments could borrow for nothing, that there would be no impact on anything. And what we've seen in the last period, since the kind of disaster budget, mini budget, is that doesn't automatically hold. And so we're in a situation now where for many households, anything that's being done through bills is being offset by the impact on their mortgages of the interest rate rises. And certainly I can see that, speaking personally, £400 rebate being offset by X amount, £100 per month increase in my mortgage doesn't actually do very much to help. If you look upstream, so I kind of characterize the kind of gas and electricity markets in terms of upstream and downstream actions. So you have things that are focused on consumers. You have the energy price guarantee that, as Joanne said, includes non-domestic consumers for the first time. And then you have the wholesale, then you have the kind of midstream regulation of networks, and then you have the upstream end to the wholesale market. And we had in the former Prime Minister's speech a proposal to move existing nuclear renewables onto a CFD. So that's the UKERC proposal. We put that idea out in about April. That's now not been superseded, but the immediate proposition is a revenue cap on nuclear renewables, at least at first, which is quite similar to the Commission proposal across the EU to cap payments to existing renewables schemes at 180 euros per megawatt hour. I'm sure Antony might come back to that. And we have, as Joanne mentioned, ongoing opposition to a windfall tax. Now, we can have a debate, and perhaps this will come up in questions as to the role or otherwise of a windfall tax. But one of the things which is in this conversation about what might happen upstream, at least in the electricity market, is it's not always obvious who is making profits in what means and how, particularly in the immediate term, because electricity is forward sold by generators, and those contracts they might be then resold by various intermediaries. It doesn't mean that it doesn't get more expensive by the time it gets sold to consumers, but it does mean that it's quite a complicated and untransparent set of arrangements in terms of who is making profits. And that's one of the reasons that it might not be possible to quickly move the arrangements for existing renewables and nuclear onto a fixed contract, because you have to wait until their forward contracts, which aren't terribly long, but they might be a year or so hence, have come to an end. So I don't think it's particularly productive to get into the pros and cons of a windfall tax. There's clear political opposition to that. I do think it's important to emphasize, though, that any action that's taken upstream, whether it's to reduce the revenues flowing to nuclear renewables, whether it's to intervene directly to push the wholesale price down, which is what the Spanish and Portuguese have done, for example, and the French, the more that you reduce the gap that needs to be filled, now that we've said that we're going to plug that gap using money flowing through from general taxation. There's no immediate plans to take action on the gas wholesale market, other than through diplomatic efforts. And the most obvious next step, since we're on this kind of sliding scale of interventionism that would have been unimaginable even a year ago, would be to ask, so exactly what social benefit is served by the amount of revenue that flows through the wholesale gas market, for example, to domestic producers, and why aren't we having a conversation about how much we're paying the Norwegians for the 27 or whatever it is % of gas that we get from Norway, and so on. Now, these things are really difficult and complicated, but there is a direct relationship between the upstream wholesale price and the level of intervention that we need in order to maintain reduce the burden on consumers. It's understandable, I think, in the macroeconomic context as to why the energy price guarantee was a market-wide intervention rather than targeted at poorer consumers. And I think you need to see that in the context of the relationship between fuel and electricity prices and the retail price index and inflation. I think also allowing the average price to go up to 3,500 would have had almost certainly recessionary implications. If we're not in a recession already, we definitely would have been. That doesn't mean, though, that there aren't many consumers perhaps are less desperately in need than others. And I think, for sure, the price freeze will protect some households from a level that would have been really difficult. For others, it might have been rather easier to shoulder, and for some, it won't be enough, which is the point that Joanne was making. Now, in the background to all of this, we've got two linked but separate consultation activities and strategy development activities, one slightly ahead of the other, with a retail market strategy and consultation that ran in the early part of this year, and a wholesale market, which is called REMA, Review of Electricity Market Arrangements, consultation that ran through the summer. So consultation closed in October, I think. These, at the moment, those two separate strands are not entirely aligned. They're linked and both makes mention of the other. But since both have implications for consumers and might be making requirements of suppliers, I think there's a very important question as to whether or not they're as joined up as they need to be. I don't know, it seems distant history now after all of the turmoil that we've seen, but the British energy security strategy, remember that, trumpeted by 2 prime ministers ago, this chap called Boris that some of you might still remember, who was once our prime minister, is still valid, and it's still in many respects provides the foundation stone for all of these other interventions, but it offers very limited action in the short term, and is very much focused on accelerating offshore wind. Yes, we will have more nuclear power stations and all of that kind of stuff. We've had flip-flopping on the role of onshore wind and fracking between our 2 prime ministers of late. And as Joanne already mentioned, we've had I can only characterize it as an opposition to any form of government-led information campaign or energy efficiency action. So as far as the energy efficiency action, which might have been run through the summer, combination of information provision and perhaps some targeted financial support to help with the easiest and quickest things that could be done to help with the most poorly insulated or drafty households, or to fix boilers that aren't working properly and that kind of thing. That basically has passed us by now. That doesn't mean that some sort of energy efficiency information campaign couldn't still run. And I know the opposition to that from the government is that it's kind of seen as telling people what to do, or perceived as being nanny state. But the research evidence suggests that actually most households have very limited information about what would be a priority action if you were trying to reduce your bill. So do you need to be turning down the thermostat? Do you need to be not using the dryer? Or will it be helpful for you to go around switching off mobile phone chargers left switch on by teenagers? No. is the answer to that. But there isn't the level of information understanding about the relative power requirements and energy use of different types of appliances is actually quite low, which means that information provision could actually be quite useful, provided the information comes from a trusted source, and perhaps the government is not that at the moment, but we can come back to that. So where does all of that leave us? I'm gonna wrap up now. I mean, Joanne, you mentioned we've got National Grid mentioning demand response for the first time. We still don't have explicit information on what consumers can do, so quite how they're going to action that demand response, other than the kind of extreme informed end of consumers, probably many of whom are in the audience or on the panel, but perhaps we're not terribly representative of the wider community. So I feel that we have had dramatic interventions that will reduce the really unimaginably difficult implications of prices going up to £3,500 or £4,000 per household. As you mentioned, Joanne, that's now going to be reviewed in the spring rather than running for 2 years. I think it's right. I think it had become inevitable that an intervention of that form would whoever had won the prime ministerial race for the first time. It still feels like a missed opportunity on the demand side. It still isn't targeted. I even had a letter from my supplier that I opened this morning that felt the need to suggest that if I wanted to, I could donate my £400 rebate to charity because I had to have it whether I wanted it or not, which I thought was an extraordinary thing to have felt the need to have provided me with. But there we are. So I think what I describe the situation looking forward into next winter with regards to prices, a mixture of the good, the not very good, and the clumsy. And I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Rob. The good, the not very good, and the clumsy. Okay, that's some food for thought there. Thank you very much. I'm not going to dwell on it anymore at the moment. We'll come back to your thoughts and questions. So now I'd like to hand over to Mike.
Brilliant. Thank you, Joanne, and good morning, everybody. Really nice to be here with you and in such lovely and brilliant company. I have got some slides to keep things mixed up. You know, we like a slide at the Climate Committee. So I'll pull those up. Have those come up, Joanne? Great, thank you. Now I can, and I can see them too. Brilliant. My job really here is to bring this back onto climate as well. That obviously is our focus. Our job is to be the government's climate conscience and make sure that when there are crises, and there's always a crisis of some sort, that the government doesn't lose track of the longer term climate crisis as well. That's kind of what we're here to do at the Climate Change Committee. So I'm very pleased to bring the energy crisis and the climate crisis together. I've been asked to pose this question really of are we missing a trick in terms of the overlaps between the two crises? And I think, you know, Rob has already hinted at this. The answer to that is a resounding yes. And the gap that we're missing is on the demand side particularly. So I'll try and put a bit of structure around that to illuminate it a bit, but that's where we're heading with this. I'll give you a bit of context and then I'll pull that together. And then I also want to look at economic growth actually, because the other change that we're seeing, you know, and Liz Truss particularly brought this in, but I think it is continuing with the current government, is this increased focus on economic growth. That's the lens that we need to be seeing things through now, as well as that energy crisis. So I want to bring that in as well, which I'll do in the final part of this. I'll start with a bit of context. I think probably this is a pretty well-informed audience, so I'll rattle through this a bit. I'm certainly not going to give you the 600 pages of the CCC progress report, but I'll just pick out a couple of key slides just to locate us in the problem that we're facing from the climate angle. And this is our killer chart, I guess, from our progress assessment. This is our view of the policy gaps when we look at the government's action on net zero, on reducing emissions. So this is UK total emissions. The dotted line across the top is where they might head if we didn't do anything, if we didn't have any policies to drive low carbon solutions. The black line down the bottom, that's where we need to get to. Those are our legislated emissions targets. So that's what we need to deliver. And then the different colours are our assessment of the policies that the government has put forward. Are they likely to actually deliver or not? And you can see that green area, we think there's about 40% of the emissions reduction. We'll probably get that from the policies that we've put forward if we implement them the way that the government has said they intend to. There's then these yellow ones. Those are not bad. With a fair wind, maybe some small tweaks, we might expect those to come through as well. And then we get into the difficult bit, because the orange here, which is about 40% of this, or just over a third. These are ones that really the policies are not properly developed yet. We haven't got the detail as to how they'll operate, or they're going to need major changes if they're going to actually drive the change. That's things like the low carbon heat market mechanism that the government's proposed. Nice idea in principle. We do not have the detail to be able to judge if it will actually deliver, and there's no way for anyone to make investments off the back of it at the moment. And then there are some areas even more concerning where actually there's no real policy at all. That would include energy efficiency for the majority of households, those not classed as fuel poor. And it would include some of the stuff on the land side particularly. So we've got these different bits, and these gaps have to be filled, right? These are legal obligations. This is what the UK needs to do to deliver our part of the Paris Agreement, and therefore to contribute to avoiding the worst effects of global warming. And every bit of warming matters, we know from the IPCC. So this is not a kind of aspirational target. Oh, look, we're getting 60%. That's not bad. Nice 2-1. This is not good enough. We need to get these policy gaps filled, and we need to get fully on track to delivering these targets. Now, I want to break this down into then the different sectors, because actually this is then the interesting bit to focus us onto the overlaps. On the left-hand side here, transport and electricity supply, and this is a snapshot for 2035, I should say, of that same chart, but now sliced between the different sectors. And you can see actually surface transport and electricity supply, those aren't too bad. We've got the zero emission vehicle mandate, we've got the contracts for difference on an annual auction cycle now for electricity supply. We're pretty confident those ought to deliver. A few details to work out, of course. Implementation has to happen, of course, but the basic policy is good. Some changes needed at the edge. The ones on the right-hand side, agriculture, land use, engineered removals, not so much for this discussion, so let's not worry about them, but they're not really where they need to be. The one I really want you to focus on really is buildings, because buildings is the biggest gap. And of course, buildings are the places where we incur these energy bills that Rob has just been talking about. They are the big place where these overlaps exist, and they're the big place where those overlaps are largely being missed so far in terms of the opportunities to deliver on both of these objectives. And also in industry, because industry obviously uses energy too, and we need to get out of fossil fuel use in industry to deliver the climate objectives as well. So in order to fill those policy gaps, we put forward in our report in June a lot of recommendations. This is just a shortened version of the priority ones. The full set has got more like 300 recommendations. I'm not going to run through these. This is just to kind of flag to you that there's a lot of work to do still to deliver on net zero, to deliver on our climate commitments. And that's the context really for the energy response we're seeing in terms of are we taking those overlaps. So let's get on to the overlaps. And I'm going to just reuse a slide that I used with the British Institute of Energy Economists a few weeks back, possibly 2 prime ministers back. I've slightly lost track. And the point I made there was that there's essentially 3 things you can do coming at this from an economist. You can move money around. You can do things on the supply side to increase your supply of alternative lower cost fuels, or you can do things on the demand side to reduce your demand of the high cost fossil fuels that we're exposed to. And what we're seeing at the moment is a pretty imbalanced response across those. We're seeing lots of action on the moving money around side, on the energy price guarantee that Rob talked about. There's a bit of targeted support in there as well to more vulnerable customers with credits that they can get against their energy costs. We have actually done a reasonable bit on the supply side, or at least we've said we're going to. That was mainly in the British energy security strategy that Rob mentioned, particularly on offshore wind, a bit on hydrogen, a bit on nuclear, but a longer burn, of course. and lots of noise on North Sea and fracking. And I think, to be honest, a bit of question about the implementation of this. There's good stuff in the British Energy Security Strategy about, unblocking things on networks, on planning, etc. I don't think we've really seen enough progress yet on actually doing those things to get these higher ambitions through. And then on the demand side, it's kind of been tumbleweed, really. We've had this very narrow energy advice service. We've had a very small increase to energy efficiency funding, but most of the opportunities there have largely been untapped. So it's been this really imbalanced response. And when I used this before, I said, well, actually, I should have done a Venn diagram here to kind of point out the overlaps. Now I've now done a Venn diagram for you. So here we go. And just kind of looking at the options. There's things that we can do that help with our energy costs, the bill discounts, the targeted support, the windfall taxes that Rob's talked about. There's things that we can do to help net zero. Those are not particularly for this conversation. They're on that slide that I had up earlier. Some of these are other sectors like land. Some of them are things like hydrogen and CCS that are important for net zero, probably more expensive than the alternative, at least at the moment. Or a bit of a longer term play in the case of green hydrogen. And then there's this sweet spot in the middle of lots of things that do help us with both of them. And then there's also, of course, some things outside of this. So there's fracking, there's new North Sea oil and gas, things that in reality are not really large enough in terms of scale that they're going to make a big difference with energy costs, particularly in the near term. If you think about the lead times from licensing new fields through exploration, through field development, etc. But that have become a bit of a distraction. And then if we just kind of highlight, I'll just bold the text of the things that have been done. We've done things that really do help with energy costs. Those had to be done, I think, in terms of the energy price guarantee and the like. We've had an awful lot of noise about fracking as it's come back in and gone back out, but it's only ever really been a distraction in that period. We have had a big play on offshore wind. As I say, more implementation to be done there. To be honest, I'm not quite sure where we are now on onshore wind and solar. We've had that moved about. I've just been off for half term, so I've missed a bit of where we are with the new Prime Minister. But it does seem rather unclear. As Joanne said at the start, that's a problem in terms of cost of capital and uncertainty for investors, not a very helpful way to do things. And we've had a tiny bit on energy advice, energy efficiency and energy market reform. We've had a bit in terms of bringing the green levies off. That helps in the near term, actually, not just for energy costs, but it also helps for net zero, because it means for the first time in a little while, it is cheaper to run a heat pump than to run a gas boiler. That is a very important shift that needs to happen, not just for the 6 months of the energy crisis, but that we need to get to as a longer term position. At the moment, all of the policy costs are loaded on electricity. Well, not at the moment, sorry, but prior to the removal of the green levies, they were all loaded on electricity and not on gas. And that has tilted the playing field against electrification. That's something that needs to be resolved for the long term, not just for the short term. And at the moment, it's only happened for the short term. And also market reforms, of course, around bringing forward the flexibility that we'll need in the power sector. Very little then on low carbon heating, very little on resource efficiency, which can play through to reduced energy costs as well. And indeed on other bits of the industrial picture like electrification, we've seen very little there. And crucially, not a lot of progress on the many recommendations that we made in June that we need to do in order to deliver the net zero programme. And one of the reasons for that is that the government has brought forward a review of the delivery of net zero with an intent to line it up much more with economic growth. So this is the last bit that I want to come to. The Skidmore review that has been put forward. We have broadly welcomed that as an idea. We don't think there's anything to be afraid of there. The fundamentals of net zero for economic growth are very strong. The issue is that we're seeing it potentially used as an extra bit of delay and an extra bit of distraction. And that is not really, that's not really very helpful for net zero or indeed for growth. And so I just want to run through a little bit how we think about that. And I'll rattle through this fairly quickly, conscious of time. And again, this is a slide that I used in a UKERC webinar a few months back that I think helps to just frame the picture. And the point I made there is that we often focus quite narrowly on the costs of net zero. We talk about the resource costs in the Climate Committee's language, and when I say we, I mean we are guilty of this in the Climate Committee, not just more broadly. We focus on the fact that low carbon technologies overall for the whole programme we typically have thought are more expensive on average than the high carbon technologies that they replace. That's been the kind of frame. And we've costed that up as being equivalent to around 0.5% of GDP. Now that's not 0.5% of the growth rate, that is 0.5% total. So over 10 years to 2035 or 13 years, you would lose 0.5% in total. So your growth would go from, if you're aiming for 2.5%, it would come down to 2.45%. In terms of the growth rate, it makes very little difference. And in the context of the inflation and the real term wages reductions we're seeing now, it's really a very small number. Now, of course, that was when we thought fossil fuel prices were a lot lower than they seem to be now. So it may well be actually that the climate programme is net cost saving. If fossil fuel prices stay anything like where they are now, then actually the shift to renewables and efficiency will improve things dramatically. But that ignores lots of other parts of the picture. It ignores the co-benefits that come with this. And if you use the Treasury's Green Book guidance and you try and cost up the air quality benefits, the health and the environment, the congestion benefits of the measures in the net zero programme, those typically outweigh the resource cost of the low carbon technology costs. And then there's a whole set of broader economic effects that we should be thinking about too. We're shifting from imported fossil fuels to low carbon investment in the local economy. That should stimulate local activity, stimulate investment, and generally be positive for growth. We did some work with Cambridge Econometrics that suggested that could be worth something like 2% of GDP boost overall. Very hard to get at these numbers. It depends on your economic school of thought. That's one view of it. There should be less volatility like we're experiencing at the moment. We shouldn't expect that in a low carbon world. We're not going to see the costs of offshore wind suddenly go from £50 a megawatt hour to £300 a megawatt hour like we've seen with gas. And of course, pushing down on demand for fossil fuels ought to feed through ultimately to lower costs of those fuels and a benefit again to the economy while we're still using them. There could be a set of industrial opportunities to tap into these new global markets. That might be things for the UK in consulting and insurance and finance, perhaps. Maybe there'll be some in production as well. Certainly, we need to make sure that the things we are producing, like cars, are the type of vehicles that people want to buy in future. So we want to be producing electric cars, not combustion engine cars, given that Europe and the other markets around the world are shifting there too. And finally, of course, we ought to expect faster productivity growth from the low carbon economy than the high carbon economy. We're moving from fuels to technologies, and technologies we know have learning rates, come down in costs. That translates to productivity growth in a way that fuels historically have not tended to do. And then finally, of course, the reason that we're doing all this, we avoid the massive damage costs of climate change by actually tackling it and doing it properly. And that probably massively outweighs all of the other things that we've talked about. So that's the kind of rough frame that the Skidmore review is playing into. And I think it leads us to kind of 5 priorities that you should focus on for green growth. The first is just to act strongly, be confident that actually doing more is likely to be better than doing less. The risk is that we move too slowly and get caught out behind on this. That's even more true in a world of high fossil fuel prices. The second is to keep costs of capital low. Again, Joanne made this point at the beginning. We've not seen a period in the last few months which has been particularly good for this in terms of stability. The UK has done pretty well on this in the past, particularly with EMR. And it is something that we can hopefully get back to. And I hope that the Skidmore review will kind of underline this for even more of the groups across Parliament and across society, and we'll have even more consensus around the shift to net zero, and we can have a bit more stability in future. And then in terms of the way that we implement policy, there are things we can do there in terms of planning ahead, avoiding bottlenecks, pinch points, and supporting innovation, and particularly using market approaches to do that. Again, EMR stands out, the electricity market reform as an example of when we've done that well, where we've had a good public-private partnership, where we've tried to make sure that we see bottlenecks coming and we unblock those, whether that's on the networks, whether it's on connections and supply chain. We need to do a lot more of that, again, on the building side, looking at skills in particular, to make sure that we aren't then getting bottlenecks as we try and increase the rate of installation of the new technologies. So we need to kind of spread that good practice of electricity market reform through the system. And then finally, maximizing those co-benefits. And this is about, the land use strategy. We've called for a strategy for land use that brings together climate and the various other environmental benefits. For example, you can think of things like urban design, where shifting to more active travel is a real opportunity to help make cities just better places to live in as well, etc. So those are kind of 5 things that we should focus on. And in this context as well, the committee's made quite a big play of just transition type points. So the fact that we're not just aiming for growth, but we should be aiming for growth that works for everyone in society, ensuring that the costs and the benefits are shared fairly, protecting the vulnerable and those negatively affected, which I think, again, brings us back to this point about transfers and targeting of the support that we've had. That applies in a climate context as well. So to wrap up then, all of this, I think, points us to the fact that the current energy crisis ought to be turbocharging net zero. It should be putting a rocket under our delivery program for net zero. We're seeing that a bit elsewhere. The IEA have told us that last week. Hopefully Antony will tell us a bit more about it. We've seen a bit of movement in that direction in the UK, particularly on the supply side, but we've had a bit of distraction, we've had a bit of delay, and we are definitely missing a trick in terms of the demand side, in terms of that energy advice, and in terms of kind of turbocharging the transition on energy efficiency and low carbon heating. We've got to do that now for the climate, we've got to do it for the energy crisis, and we've got to do it actually for the economic growth puzzle that we're facing. So it's time to get on with it. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Mike. It's very nice to hear to see the Venn diagram. We too often get stuck in that, we need to focus on the current crisis and forget about everything else. It's very good to see the two brought together. So thank you very much. I'd now like to hand over to Antony. Welcome, Antony.
Great, thank you very much. And it's a great pleasure to be here, and in particular to follow on from those 2 presentations. So yeah, I just wanted to talk through what's happening in Europe, where I think we are, and maybe some suggestions or thoughts about the future. So got 4 areas just to touch upon. The first ones I'll sort of flick through quite quickly, which is sort of the pre-war, what was happening beforehand, then the early stage of the war in Europe, and what was the EU's response, then looking a bit to what's happening in Ukraine at the moment, which I'd argue is sort of the weaponization of energy, and then some medium-term thoughts in terms of the future. So yeah, I'll try and, as I said, rattle through the beginning bits and then maybe go into a bit more detail in terms of where we are. But I do think it's important to stress the extent to which what we saw in the second half of last year was a tightening of the market, the increasing of the energy prices for a combination of reasons. I think there was one is, as we came out of COVID, the increase in demand leading to higher prices, and then the increase in demand not being matched by increase in supply. Some argue that it was about unavailability of fossil fuels, in part because people's realization of the need to decarbonize, so therefore there wasn't adequate investment in fossil fuels, but also maybe to some extent the difficulties in accelerating the non-fossil fuels, so deployment taking longer for renewables or other technologies, and yeah, overall inadequate investment to meet that increasing demand. The second area, which is maybe more contentious, but I think is clear, is that in particular in Europe, Russia was restricting its exports of gas. So there was some preparation. There was starting to see gas being used as a geopolitical tool. So meeting contracts, but no more, leading to further tightening of the markets. And this was very clear, I think, in particular in November, December of last year. So prior to the 24th of February, we saw higher energy prices. But obviously, once you had the invasion, then there was a significant market reaction. And the reasons for that are clear, and everyone is all too aware. Russia's importance within the energy sector on the global level, in terms of it produces roughly 10% of, or did prior to the war, roughly 10% of fossil fuel energy. And I think importantly, that is across all three. So that's gas, oil, and coal. So what happened in terms of sanctions and market reaction wasn't restricted to a single fossil fuel. Also worth mentioning, not often discussed though, Russia is also an important producer of uranium, and in particular for nuclear fuel plants or nuclear plants in Europe. It is in some cases the sole provider of nuclear fuel. So we saw a massive reaction from the markets, significant spiking of prices, which were most impactful on Europe, and in particular because of Europe's dependency on gas and pipe gas, as is well discussed. But it also then that rippled out to other parts of the world, and we saw higher energy prices affecting many countries, thousands of miles away from Europe, and not even directly supplied by Europe. We then saw the implementation of sanctions by the EU and a desire to specific targets to restrict dependency on fossil fuels from Russia. And as we saw this summer, the UK no longer importing any fossil fuels from Russia for the first time for decades, and in particular Europe decreasing its supply from Russia. So that was a clear response. And then the EU started its policy response in May with its RE-Power EU policy, which I guess headlined on the renewables, and there was a specific requirement to increase the dependency on renewable energy. And maybe just take a step back, they increased the target for 2030, but that wasn't the first time that target had been increased. So the target was first set in the run-up to the Paris Agreement. So back in 2015 was Paris, but in the run-up to that is when the EU set its 2030 targets, which were that by 2030, the EU would reduce its emissions by 40%. And of that, you would see an increase in the use of renewables to around 32%. Then running up to Glasgow, you saw the Fit for 55 package, so increasing the renewable energy target to 55%, and a target to increase renewables to 40%. So significant increase in that time. And then as a result of the war, you saw the EU saying, actually, we will further accelerate renewables to supply 45% of the EU's energy, not electricity, energy, by 2030. So currently around 22% of the EU's energy coming from renewables. So basically doubling it in the next 7 to 8 years. So that is a remarkable target if it were to be achieved. And to give an indication of the scales of the technologies that we're talking about, from a solar PV perspective, there is around 150 gigawatts of solar on the grid at the moment. And the intention is by 2030, that will be 600. So obviously a fourfold increase in the deployment of solar PV. Obviously there is an opportunity in that, is that we've seen really significant falls in solar costs over the last decade, but still that is a mighty challenge. And the other thing to note, I guess, is if you're talking about 45% of energy coming from renewables, then, and electricity is the sector that is more rapidly decarbonizing or rapidly deploying renewables, then that will be much further along. So probably about 70–80% of the power sector coming from renewables, with probably the rest being the residual nuclear. So that is a really radically different power sector in terms of how it is operated. The need for different types of storage, interconnectors, dynamic demand, hydrogen, etc. So the challenge, I would argue, isn't just about the renewables, it's about how to operationalize such a system. So that's one part of the strategy. The second, obviously, is energy savings. And first, that was introduced in terms of overall gas demand, to reduce gas demand by 15%, and then to start reducing the peak demand for electricity. And it's worth highlighting, I guess, the extent to which there is also encouraged by the Commission, and I think it's fair to say not mandated, but encouraged by the Commission, there would also be public information campaigns. And we've seen that in, just to give a couple of examples, in the Netherlands, Zet de Kop om, that's my very good Dutch, as you can well hear, but that means flip the switch, a national campaign in the Netherlands. And Germany, the strapline was 80 million together for energy change. So that there is significant attention being placed upon consumers, both from the retail, from the business sector, but also on the household level, to change energy. And as the two speakers, or all three people have noticed, we are all really quite embarrassed and annoyed at the extent to which you see government ministers, and a quote from here saying, "We are not a nanny state government," using that as an excuse to not increase public awareness about the opportunities to save energy. And I think in particular, I would argue that given the current situation and the extent to which the UK consumer or the UK taxpayer is paying for bills, we have an absolute right to be more engaged in how energy is used. So on the positive side, greater energy saving, greater intentions to increase renewable energy deployment, but it's clearly not all rosy. We've seen increasing coal demand in the EU, IEA saying that year on year in the first half of this year, we've seen an increase in coal demand up by 16%. And over the year, the IEA expect a 7% increase in coal use. Again, not surprising. Existing coal stations are operating for longer hours. It becomes more economic for them to do so, but also the extent to which coal stations have been unmothballed and are now likely to operate for a number of years. The other area that we saw in the EU, and again, not surprising, is the extent to which we are, the EU is relying more on liquefied natural gas to replace the loss of gas from Russia. And that new capacity is coming online, 20 BCM expected this year, with a further 51 in 2023. So yeah, that is the construction of floating terminals in Germany, more permanent terminals in Germany and other parts of the world. So I guess that raises concerns in terms of on what contracts are these being built or bought over. Are we seeing a longer term lock-in for the use of liquefied natural gas? But clearly not surprising given the shortfalls in gas. And then, yeah, worth also mentioning, obviously, the potential restart of nuclear in a couple of nuclear power plants in Germany, or their continual operation beyond what was agreed phase out dates. Germany is discussing some life extensions and maybe some additional coal build, nuclear build, in the same way that the UK has said this is a longer term solution. But that's another area that we need to look at. Just want to touch upon, obviously, the EU has taken up liquefied natural gas that was on the global market. Given the fact that many of the gasifiers were already at maximum capacity or close to maximum capacity, the EU has basically effectively taken other people's liquefied natural gas because we can afford to pay higher prices. And that has meant in other parts of the world, you're seeing a switching maybe to coal or just unaffordability of gas. So it isn't without a cost in other parts of the world, as the EU has intended to switch away from that. So a mixed bag in terms of the EU reaction, immediate reaction. Just a couple more things to highlight. One is the weaponization of energy. And I do think it is becoming clearer day by day in terms of the strategy of Russia, in terms of to destroy critical infrastructure domestically. So we've seen, in early parts of the war, the targeting of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, that had a real threat implication. Obviously, Ukraine, as site of the world's worst nuclear accident in Chernobyl in 1986, people are very aware of the consequences of large-scale releases of radiation. So it has a public terror threat, but also has a clear energy implication. Zaporozhye, or nuclear in Ukraine, provides around, or did provide around 50% of electricity. Zaporozhye is the largest of the nuclear power plants, providing around 40% of total nuclear. So in total, around 20% of electricity generation came from the power plant that's now switched off from the Ukrainian grid. And so that has a material impact in terms of electricity supply, as does threats to hydro dams that we're starting to see, and in fact, bombing of these. So it is very clear that power rationing is taking place. The heating systems, localized heating systems are being targeted, as is water. So the strategy as we move to winter by Russia is to, I guess, force people out of Ukraine through lack of energy, heating and water. And this is clearly a devastating approach. And it's just worth emphasizing the extent to which harsher winter occurs in these parts of the world. The temperature in Ukraine at night doesn't go above, in Kiev, doesn't go above zero, usually from November to April. So heating is absolutely essential. And this is, clearly an implication in terms of refugees coming into the EU and destabilizing the European continent more generally. So just in the last couple of minutes, just to touch upon issues for the medium term that I think worth strengthening or worth stressing. Firstly, the extent to which government expenditures, and it's been mentioned in terms of the UK, the sort of 100 billion roughly that was expected to cost if the household subsidy continued for a year. But the UK is not alone. It's probably around €500 billion of government support for energy consumers over the next year. Some of that on the member state will come from member state budgets, and the EU is talking about redirecting some of its cohesion funds in this direction. So clearly a big hit on budgets this year. And also, obviously, the impact in terms of heavy industry, real concerns in Germany in terms of the consequence of higher energy prices, and we're starting to see closures of business, and there is a fear that these will not reopen. I'd like to stress in terms of next year, and I think this is starting to be recognised, but obviously there has been success in terms of the EU in filling up gas storages. So they're around 90% full, 95% full at the current time. But it is expected that they will be significantly depleted over this winter. And then because we have fixed or relatively fixed import capacity in terms of LNG, and we have a significant reduction in importation of gas from Russia, the EU's major supplier. Currently, imports from Russia of gas are around 1/6 what they were at the start of this year. The ability to refill stores during the summer will be significantly reduced. So in many ways, the threats for the winter are much worse next winter. And I think that highlights the need for us to really look upon the next 12 months or 18 months as absolutely crucial in terms of more energy saving and bringing on, accelerating the deployment of new supply options that can deliver something by the winter of 2023-2024. So clear and present or clear need for urgent action in this area. Two more areas. One is just to touch upon market reform. As the UK, the EU is looking at how to market reform given the changing circumstance. So decoupling the gas and electricity price, in particular targeting or reducing revenue or excess revenues from renewables and nuclear, looking at common gas buying policies, restructuring development and efficiency improvements in terms of allocation. All of these are possible, necessary, but come with higher political challenges within the EU. And maybe just worth mentioning on a sort of slightly optimistic note at the end of this is there has been progress. And I think the war has shown the importance of cooperation between the UK and the EU, particularly important sort of post-Brexit. And in two main areas so far. Firstly, the extent to which the UK is a gateway to European gas, the use of the LNG that is terminals that are located in the EU. Probably around 15% of the gas that's in the European stores flowed through the UK. Our importance will diminish as other energy capacity comes online, but will remain really important over the next 18 months. And I think that is recognised. And maybe that is part of what we saw in the European Political Community meeting that Liz Truss attended in October. The EU, it was suggested that the EU would rejoin the North Seas Energy Cooperation Forum to, in particular, help develop the North Sea hubs for offshore electricity. Clearly really important in terms of offshore wind, both within the UK and the EU as an important avenue for us to develop renewable energy. So cooperation in this area is absolutely vital. And maybe the final point is just to flag that as we shift from a fossil fuel dependent system, there is growing concern about us not wanting to become over dependent on other producers. In particular, people are concerned about China. So there are intentions to improve the production of low carbon technologies, solar panels, EV batteries, etc. And this is a real opportunity for the UK and the EU to increase collaboration in this area. So I do think, there are many opportunities for us to re-engage with the EU, both in terms of the direct supply of fuels, but also in terms of the energy transition and new technologies. Thank you very much.
Brilliant, Antony. Thank you so much. It's very timely for us to be reminded that in energy terms, we are very definitely not an island. So thank you very much for those thoughts. Okay, 5-minute break now, everybody, and it will be just 5 minutes and then we'll carry on. So quick comfort break and see you in 5 minutes. Thank you. Okay, everybody, welcome back. I hope you feel a little refreshed and ready to refocus. We are getting lots of great questions in the Q&A. Thank you very much, everybody. If I can encourage you to continue to post those and also to upvote the ones that you agree with, because I can't see us getting through all of these in the time we've got available. So I will choose the ones that most people seem to want us to answer above others. So give them ticks if you want them to be answered. Okay, fantastic. So back to the matter at hand. We've had 3 presentations with some really interesting, stimulating, challenging material. I'm now going to ask our 2 respondents to give us their thoughts on what that made them think and what they think should happen next. So first of all, I'd like to hand over to Elizabeth.
Thank you, and thank you for those really thought-provoking and nuanced presentations from this morning. I've made copious notes, so you'll probably hear me flicking through them as I respond. So I mean, what I came to this session with is the experience that we have at Citizens Advice of the human impact of the energy crisis as it's being experienced in Great Britain, in particular for those people that Rob's kicked us off with, saying really needed that targeted support. The way that we see many of those people at Citizens Advice is when they're struggling to top up their prepayment meter. So there's people who are forced to pay in advance for their energy, usually by going to the local shop. Now, at Citizens Advice, already this year, we've seen more people come to us unable to top up their prepayment meter than the previous 3 years combined. The scale of the need is unlike anything I've ever seen in my career, and I've been doing energy since 2002. We're supporting people with crisis intervention at a rate which I really struggle to get my head around. 2 people every minute need crisis support from Citizens Advice. That's to connect them to a food bank or to get them a fuel voucher so they feel confident that they can switch their fridge back on. The amount of the intensity of the rationing behaviour which is happening in so many homes up and down the country in response to this crisis really can't be underestimated. Now, of course, I acknowledge that we're here talking and thinking about energy, but I think we need to also accept that some really significant intervention is needed beyond the energy system. So in particular, Citizens Advice is calling for the government to urgently confirm that they will be uprating benefits in April in line with inflation. Because as long as we see the government to drag their feet and not respond to the impact of inflation on people in benefits, we will just continue to see that volume of people who are contacting Citizens Advice because they simply can't afford to pay their energy bills or indeed for any of their other necessities. So what does this mean in terms of the themes that we're thinking and talking about today? Well, it means that the topics in that sweet spot that we saw in that Venn diagram are absolutely urgent, not only for the sake of the planet, but also for people and their health, their well-being, this winter and beyond. In particular, I wanted to talk and reflect a bit more on those sweet spots in the middle, because they picked up on so many of the themes from our discussion, from our presentations this morning. So at Citizens Advice, we know that what people need to participate in the energy system and absolutely to get the best out of the transition to net zero, a just transition, is that people need information, they need protection, and they need support. So in terms of support, what I'm particularly thinking about is what Rob started off with, that targeted support in terms of support for people and in this season, this period of very intense high prices. And listening to our update from Antony about the extent of the challenge that's ahead of us is very likely to be with us for many months and years to come. But I think I'd highlight that I don't think we've got a targeted mechanism in mind, a consensus on who those people are that need to be identified, or indeed who is best placed to identify them. I spend most of my time thinking and looking at energy retail, and there's often an expectation that energy support can be delivered by energy suppliers. And yet what I see in my inbox today is a plethora of challenges that people are facing in accessing the support, the £400 support, which is supposed to be making its way through to people at the moment, particularly, again, people on prepayment meters who have to go to a shop to top up, not being able to get to the shop when it's open, not being able to use their vouchers, not being able to access that absolutely vital support. When it comes to thinking then about the medium and longer term support, in that middle of that then was the good advice and energy efficiency. Now, on energy efficiency, we've published research recently that highlights that the least efficient homes are paying an extra £950 more to heat their homes. The opportunity is enormous. Now, that research is relatively new, but I can see lots of names on this call of people who have been saying things similarly for literally decades. We've got this new urgency and this frame around energy security for energy efficiency intervention. And it's absolutely crucial that all of us take that very seriously, that call to action on government to urgently accelerate the intervention in people's home when it comes to energy efficiency. I would note, though, that there's still some relatively small tweaks that could support people in accessing the schemes, smaller they are, that can support people at the moment. Only 3/4 of people who are eligible for the energy company obligation are aware of ECO as a scheme. And that's why we think that there's this role for advice, not only with the future of a transition to net zero, but also that the support that's already available. We talked earlier about advice. I want to just highlight that to reiterate the point that was made about the need for trusted advice, not only to get the support, get people to access support that's already there, but also to avoid the scams that we've seen flourish, particularly in connection to energy efficiency and renewable energy interventions in the home. We need to make sure that people can get that bespoke advice about how they need to adapt the fabric of their home, and also how to adapt their behaviour, not in an exaggerated, self-rationing way that have these incredible implications, negative implications for their health, but in a positive, empowered way that mean people can afford the energy that they need when they need it, and access the additional support that's needed for consumers up and down the country. I'll leave it there so we get plenty of time for questions, and over to our next respondent.
Elizabeth, thank you very much. Lots of very valid and important points there, so thank you. And I'll now turn to Juliet to add her thoughts.
Thanks everyone, and thanks to the speakers for the brilliant presentations. I was scribbling down notes and strongly agreeing with a lot of what was said. But yeah, I wanted to pick up on the three different areas which were covered today and kind of build some additional ideas from our side at E3G. So over the last year, we've been engaging with the government around policy solutions to help us address the high prices. And I think, you know, as we're now moving into this phase away from universal support, with the government saying that they'll end the energy price guarantee from next April, the stakes are higher than ever before. We've heard from citizens' advice that we're already facing a fuel poverty emergency, and this could even get worse next year. So we need a real warlike focus on these short-term measures, which could mean that people don't slip through the safety net from next April, but also the long-term solutions as well, which pick up on the points around emissions and driving down our dependency on fossil gas for the long term, as well as boosting energy efficiency. So when thinking about the financial support, the reason why the government went for a universal approach in the first place is because making sure that there's really targeted support at the scale and scope required is actually very challenging. And there needs to be some tests in place to make sure that from April, that the right level is provided, and that should mean there's no cliff edge in the first instance. So making sure that until there is a system which is really robust enough, the government should taper things out slowly and gradually. The second test is around ensuring that the right number of households are supported, as measures such as means tested benefit, you know, they're a good starting place, but ultimately there'll be many more homes who aren't currently on benefits who won't be able to cope with £4,000 energy bills. So the scale will need to be substantial. And also the adequate levels of support as well, as different vulnerable households will have different energy demands and requirements, and that should be acknowledged by any sufficient support package. But as well as those kind of short-term measures, we also need to address the long-term solutions as well. And retrofit, which is the area that I work on, is a key part of this, kind of acknowledged by all the speakers today. And there's no silver bullet here. Industry has been decimated by boom-bust decision-making in the past and rightly sceptical of sugar rush policies. So a long-term and holistic approach will be needed. We've identified a range of different measures which will help support that, many of those which were picked up already by speakers today, but public awareness raising and tailored advice, it really is the lowest hanging fruit, one of the greatest returns on investment for the government. So it makes total sense for that to be the first thing to press go on before April. Secondly, we really think there's a need for more support for the skills and supply chain as well. If we want retrofit industry to scale up at speed, they need to know there's that long-term demand for certainty and support for investing in UK PLC with manufacturing, with skills, with supply chains, with training opportunities. We also think one of the quickest ways that the government can ramp up retrofit action is through boosting those existing government-backed schemes. So we already have a number of successful programmes in place, including the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund, the Public Sector Decarbonisation Scheme, as well as the Sustainable Warmth competitions, which are focused at low income households. These can really be supercharged to move things forward at scale. So the government can top these up, providing the financial firepower in line with the manifesto commitments for 2019. And also we can look to address some of the nuts and bolts which are currently holding back companies from really delivering the full potential. And these can be small things. They can be addressing some of the compliance issues that installers are facing. These can be addressing some of the skills gaps and the knowledge gaps. So these aren't necessarily high technical solutions, but they're ways that we can make sure that more money is getting out the door for those households which need it. And as well as kind of supercharging those existing schemes, I think we also need to look at supporting new schemes to build mass markets across different tenures. The UK's housing stock is very diverse. There's lots of different people in lots of different situations, and we need to think carefully about how we can incentivise and support those different people. Thinking about the private rented sector, how can we encourage landlords to do more to support private rented tenants? With social housing, there could be opportunities to achieve economies of scale through things like street by street retrofits, which are gaining in popularity and interest. And most importantly, for the owner-occupier tenure, who have received kind of a bit of an oversight of policy attention over recent years. And there's lots of opportunities to support this sector, including, we think, through the UK Infrastructure Bank, looking at concessional loans, things like energy saving stamp duty, which could help incentivise more retrofits at that point of sale, and a whole host of other ideas as well. And finally, all of this needs to be underpinned by long-term certainty, as this is what's really needed to spur public and private confidence in the future ahead for home retrofits. And all of this links nicely to Mike Thompson's presentation on emissions, and in particular, the heat and building strategy, where there's real concern that some of the areas which were contained in that strategy have been kicked into the long grass. So we're yet to see the consultation response for tightening energy efficiency standards in the private rented sector. We have to see the government moving forward in introducing regulatory standards for social housing energy efficiency, or for owner occupiers, which, as we've heard, is the major gap here. And we're also yet to hear about phasing out fossil heating systems in on-grid and off-grid homes. So there's lots the government needs to do and accelerate to really move things forward from both an energy security but also an energy bills perspective. And then finally, thinking about Europe, there's some really good examples, I think, from across the EU, which the UK could learn from. In particular, at E3G, we really like the KfW German Development Bank concessional loan programme, which back in the last oil crisis in the 1970s helped us really spur a mass market for home retrofits. And the return on investment for the government is huge. For every €1 they invest, there's a €6 return to the economy. So this is a real excellent opportunity for the UK government to learn from a German example and hopefully replicate the same success here in the UK. And finally, I think some of the opportunities as well, we talked about growth. And for example, many European countries are looking to go big on heat pumps in their response, which I think has been one of the areas also quite missing in the UK's response to date. We've seen recent evidence from Nesta, which shows that heat pumps can play a really significant role in reducing household exposure to volatile gas rates, even given the current electricity mix, which I know still contains gas. So if the UK wanted to turn its quite significant heating manufacturing expertise to heat pumps, this could be a big opportunity. So I'll stop there and we can turn to the questions. But yeah, thanks again to the speakers.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Juliet. It's nice to finish on a solutions-focused set of comments. So that's brilliant. Thank you. Well, we've got a lot of questions in the chat, and I'm going to do my best to cover as many of them as I can in this next half an hour or so that we have for a discussion. I'd like to start. The first one I'd like to start with is we've had quite a focus in what we've been talking about on people's energy use in their homes and the crisis for people in home energy use. Christian asked us if we can please comment on non-home energy costs and resilience. So transport costs and the ability to adapt to a 50% increase in prices for petrol and diesel, but also for electricity if you've got an EV. What should government be doing to help people with their transport costs? Or should we be saying that high prices are good because they reduce demand for travel? Mike, I'm going to come to you first on that one, if that's okay.
Thanks, Joanne. I mean, I think, oh, sorry, I clicked the wrong button. I meant to unmute and I turned off my video instead. Thank you. Yeah, I think this is part of the energy advice as well. You know, we've seen this in Europe. We've seen it from the IEA that when they do their list of things that can be done, one of them is about reducing journeys, and it's also about reducing average speed. You know, and you see a bit of this happens naturally, that as petrol prices go up then and diesel prices, then people do tend to slightly reduce their speeds on the motorway, but it isn't widespread particularly. And it is an opportunity obviously for people. So look, some of it is happening anyway as a price response. I don't think that's a particularly satisfactory way of cutting emissions and cutting oil use, because again, you want people to be doing this in a positive way rather than cutting back on things that potentially make their lives more difficult. You know, we know that there's a pump for transport puts a very, very high value on time losses with good reason. So if people are losing time, then there is a kind of welfare cost attached to that. So yes, this is something that ought to be in the advice service as well, that where people are looking to cut their costs. And I think it's a difficult one, isn't it? Because it definitely fits into that kind of the government stating the obvious. And so I think it does have to be part of a wider sensitive package that is also not just stating the obvious, but also providing some genuinely helpful stuff, like talking about boiler flow temperatures, like connecting people up with relatively easy things that they can do on draft proofing, say, but also with good installers and community schemes, and linking them into the eco, say, if they don't know about it. So I think you've got to be a bit careful with it, because it does sound a bit daft to tell people, well, you could do fewer journeys and save a bit of money. Have you thought about that? But I think if it's alongside a package which is doing genuinely helpful things as well, then there's maybe more space for it.
Great, thanks, Mike. Elizabeth, did you want to add anything on the travel costs issue?
Yes, thank you. I think it's really important to bring a distributional lens to that conversation. I think that there's this, it's transport and energy. I think it's true that there's really well-meaning and needed advice for people who are able to make changes that make an impact for their own budgets. But that narrative can take us down a route which then ignores people who aren't able to make small changes and save a lot of money, people who haven't got access to reliable public transport, who haven't got access to a car at all. And then the assumptions that there are small behavioural changes kind of based on this deficit model of consumers. Why don't you just do these sensible things? Well, those sensible things are accessible probably for many of us on this call, but there are not only a very large amount of the population now who don't have access to affordable transport already, and that number is growing. So I think we need to be really nuanced in our discussions about who is able and to take that advice and therefore to secure the savings. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Rob, did you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I think just to say, which sounds a little bit like dodging the question, that the issues in the transport sector are quite different. UKERC does have a mobility theme that's focused on transport decarbonisation and societal issues across the piece. If you look at the relative scale of the swings in price, although the swings in petrol prices at the pump have been significant, they haven't been 500%. So we have seen this unprecedented increase in stationary energy prices in the last year or so. But we're quite familiar with quite significant swings in prices for motorists as well, and we certainly saw record low prices during the COVID lockdowns, and then we did see very significant upswings towards the end of last year. And of course, fuel prices are high. There's a quite complex interplay of issues that we could probably devote an entire other webinar to around mobility, around, in the longer term, some of the things that the government is doing to relax the planning regime for new housing, much of which has the potential to lock in demand for car-based travel, because kind of aspirations to try and avoid doing that appear to have been largely ignored in the kind of rush for growth. So there's a more obvious, I know there's another question about growth versus non-growth. There are more obvious kind of negative implications of the kind of interrelationships between travel and land use planning, particularly over the longer term, and the kind of the decarbonisation agenda that we're going on. One of the things that I think we might try and do something on in our annual review of energy policy that UKERC puts out and coming out at the end of this year will be what the signs are around demand for EVs, because originally we saw a burgeoning demand for EVs as a result of what was happening with fuel prices, road fuel prices. And my understanding is that that's now been a bit blunted or muted by increases in the price of electricity, or at least a perception that the EV ownership has got more expensive. And I think that's a reflection of the relative price movements that I alluded to at the beginning of my response. So at the risk of sounding a little bit like good question, therefore we're not going to answer it, there's a whole set of issues around mobility and road transport that UKERC deals with, but which we may need to come back to in order to address properly.
Yeah. As you say, Rob, we could probably talk about this all morning in a completely separate webinar. So transport is important. We mustn't forget about it. And there is work going on to tackle it. So I want to change the focus now. And we've got a number of questions around how do we persuade the government that X technology is something they ought to invest in. So I just want to try and bring a few of those together if I can. So I think it's around two issues. One is, how do we get better at investing in our own resources in advance of shocks and crises? There's a few questions and comments in the chat about, we've had, the 2009 global oil depletion report from UKERC that said this is coming down the line. Why didn't we invest in homegrown renewables then? So there's that element of forethought and proactivity in terms of our investment in our resilience. Why are we not better at that? And linked to that, there's a number of questions around, why does government not understand that people would like to see more of things, onshore wind being the one that's specifically mentioned? Government says, no, people don't want it, but maybe people do want it. So how do we move from where we are to a system where government is more open to the idea that people like these things, and B, invests in advance of a crisis? Who'd like to go first on that one? Don't all step back at once. Antony, would you like to come in?
Just because everyone else can then correct what I'm saying, so that's it ends up with a good balance at the end. I think on the second point is, in terms of people do want it, there is clearly a set of people that want it, but the question is, are they the people that the government is listening to, and in particular the individual party members are talking to? And I do think the whole activities over the summer in terms of the election of between Truss and Rishi Sunak was a really clear example of that. They were not talking to us, they were talking to their membership, and their membership have a view that onshore wind, solar, etc., is not something that they want. And so therefore it is absolutely skewed in terms of this discussion. I think the question is, how do we break that logjam so that it is a discussion that is taking place with the wider population and not just a select group of people that they want to particularly influence. And I do, I guess I am optimistic that in particular the economic advantages that we start seeing from renewables, in particular because of high energy prices, overcome some of the concerns that people may have from a governmental perspective. But it is very clear that in order for things to be smoother, we need to have a planning process that is more streamlined, but also it doesn't sort of totally ignore or go roughshod over individual communities' wishes. So I think for me, that is the key balance that we need to look at. And again, if I just talk about the EU, it is very clear that there is a desire to a need to accelerate deployment of these technologies, and how do you do that within existing planning restraints is absolutely crucial. And maybe I'll just quickly one sentence on the first question. It's about resilience, isn't it? And where you have an economy that is deemed to be successful if it is efficient, then you do not want to pay for resilience within it. And I think it is that shift that we need to try to change. And I guess the energy and the gas sector is a really important example of that. It was deemed unnecessary to have domestic gas storage through Rough. It was going to get expensive to refurbish it and keep it operational. And the market would provide through LNG, and in some ways it has, but that cost benefit analysis maybe has gone wrong in terms of we seeing what the price of us not having that resilience within the system is. And I think that is true across different sectors. So it's how do we ensure that all of our critical infrastructure needs are resilient, and we have to accept that maybe there is a cost associated with that, and that is a price that's worth paying.
Thank you, Antony. Juliet, did you want to come in on this one?
Yeah, I think this is quite a commonly asked question by all of us in the sector, particularly on retrofit. It just seems like such an obvious solution that everyone's calling for, and yet it seems like an area where we've really stalled recently. And I think from our understanding, there's a few things which have really held things back. And one of them has been the fact that the government has in the past launched retrofit schemes, which perhaps been well-intentioned but not quite fulfilled their promise. So there's obviously the Green Deal, which was a loan scheme which never really got off the ground, and then recently the Green Homes Grant, which was a scheme kind of intended as a stimulus measure in the wake of the pandemic, to stimulate the market, but unfortunately due to administrative issues, the government had to pull it short. I think it's fair to say that the government got its fingers burnt by those schemes, and MPs were getting complaints in their inboxes about these schemes which weren't working, and that has caused some hesitancy in government. And I think it's important to kind of address that and circumvent it. So thinking, how can we scale up retrofit sustainably? And I think one of the answers is, rather than trying to design a new scheme from scratch overnight, let's begin by ramping up those existing schemes and supply chains which are already functioning. Yes, they need some fine tuning, but they're there to be built on. So we really welcome the government giving 1 billion to this new Eco Plus programme, which is an extension on existing energy company obligation, which energy companies carry out for fuel core homes. And if the government is looking to establish new schemes and initiatives, which we strongly encourage, these should be made in the close coordination with industry, taking the time to get it right and really focus on those nuts and bolts of delivery to make sure we don't have a repeat of some of the flop schemes of the past. And I guess the other side of the coin is concerns around, can industry actually absorb this money? If we throw more money at retrofit, are there enough installers out there who can actually go out and deliver across the UK? And again, I think the answer to this is, let's focus on the skills and supply chains, as well as just trying to throw money at the problem, making sure that there are enough skilled installers, there are enough manufacturers who are able to produce the materials we need. So I think whilst there are some challenges, these aren't insurmountable, and we've seen other EU countries doing it as well.
Okay, thank you, Juliet. So we've talked there a little bit about how do we get government to understand what people want and help them access it. And we've got another question related to that, which is about communities helping themselves and improving their own resilience. We've got a question from a student who says they're deeply concerned about not only the rising energy costs, but especially how it's affecting those who are struggling the most. Why is there not more focus into helping communities to help themselves by encouraging installation of off-grid devices within the community? And they mention a project in Swansea that does this. Surely this would also help with emissions and with strain on the grid. So community energy of all sorts, what more should we be doing to encourage that as a resilience option, as a way to help lower income households and as a way to meet our emissions targets? Who would like to come in on that one? Mike, do you want to have a go with that one first?
I can have a start here. I mean, from our perspective, kind of local action and community action generally it's one of the great untapped opportunities, because government has kind of just left it out there and hasn't made any effort to kind of join up national policy with local government policy. Sorry, I'm overstating saying they haven't done any, because as Juliet said, you know, actually the local authority housing program has been effective, but kind of writ large, there hasn't been enough in terms of setting out what is the role of central government, where does devolved government sit in, where do local authorities, communities, then private businesses, individual households, what are all the different roles and how do they all fit together, matching that then with funding and incentives and expectations for local authorities. And government kind of risks being a bit of a blocker, I think, on some of this stuff. If you kind of put the market rules there, that can help. If you engage with local area energy planning, that's kind of another big missing piece in the puzzle that, you know, has been bubbling along but just hasn't really made progress. Then you can create an opportunity for some of these to push forward delivery, and we're in that phase where delivery is everything, right? So I you know, from our perspective, it is there's a window of opportunity to unleash that more. We know that all the local authorities have declared climate emergencies, and they've set really bold emissions targets, but they don't necessarily universally know how to translate that or have the resources to translate that into what needs to happen overall. So I think it's right to kind of tap at it and say, well, how do we do it better? And part of it is attention, because it just hasn't had enough attention from central government, I think.
Thanks, Mike. Rob, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I did. So there's just a few thoughts really. So UKERC has a theme that's looking at kind of local governance issues and local solutions, and that's predicated on what we frame as a question as rather than an assertion of fact that more local solutions can help with progress towards net zero and so on. And I think it's quite important to distinguish between decentralized small-scale solutions, like small-scale renewables, community or local authority level opportunities like the development of district heating, and or the role of local government in helping to enable retrofit, or community organisations, by which I mean energy efficiency improvement in houses, sorry, just to be clear, or the role of community and other local actors and agents in enabling change. And certainly if you look more widely internationally, there are varying degrees of action and agency at the municipal level with regards to energy. So there's a tradition in some parts of Northwestern Europe for much more agency for city governments, and that tends to be correlated with a larger role for district heating, for example. Also correlates with climate. They tend to be colder. Northwestern Europe very much nearer the nearest neighbours, actually, well, France is a much more centralised model. And I think I'd also be really cautious about the idea that off-grid solutions are going to improve resilience, because apart from the very, very small number of very remote locations which are served by a weak grid that is vulnerable to storms in the UK, we're a largely urban, densely populated island with a very well-developed electricity and gas infrastructure. Now, I'm not saying that doesn't mean that we can't do more local, smaller scale, solar and wind farms and so on, but not connecting them to the grid doesn't do anything for resilience or price. I just don't see that as it is not borne out by the facts, I'm afraid. It's almost certainly going to be less reliable and more expensive than doing a grid connected solution in our context, and that's just the reality of it. So I think what we need to be is quite nuanced in thinking about the role of the smaller scale. We should also be completely clear that we have excellent wind resources, many of which are in remote locations and or in offshore, which are best served by large-scale developments with the network upgrading that we need in order to access those resources. And that is also a collective endeavour that requires political support and community engagement and buy-in. And it's to everyone's advantage. And we should just be clear about that and not imagine a kind of non-existent local everything solution that just doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
I'll stop there.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more. Although I would point out that a community energy scheme, I mean, just to be clear, doesn't have to be off the grid. It can be a grid connected community energy scheme.
Of course.
Part of the mix.
Absolutely, completely. It's just the question said off grid, I think.
Yes, absolutely. Elizabeth, I know you wanted to come in on this.
Yeah, thank you. So I think that I'd just like to highlight that the opportunity of that local voice is to be the trusted face and engaging with the interventions that can make a difference. And I think that I'd like to acknowledge the nuance there for more about the role of, for example, local authorities in retrofit and other things where you really want those boots on the ground in the local area being being able to show people their neighbours and the difference that it's made there. So I think it is really important to draw those lines about where we know there's excellent evidence from for example, other European countries about where having that local take on energy has been so transformative because of this point around trust. However, I think we need to acknowledge that where local authorities have dipped their toe in energy, that it hasn't always gone particularly well. So I'm afraid we've had some very poor outcomes around solar for some local authority schemes, and particularly what I had in mind was the councils who tried to set up energy retailers. So I think we need to be really have our eyes wide open when we're thinking about what risk appetite there is in local authorities, because of the pace that we need to move at to get to net zero at a pace that will ultimately make a difference for us, particularly on an island. And therefore, I think it is really important that we go to what we know works, thinking about retrofit and which partners can deliver that at pace.
Super, thank you, Elizabeth. We've got time for one more question and then a wrap up from each of you. So I'm going to try and combine a few of the most upvoted ones into one theme, which is that we've got a number of questions about how willing people are to change their energy use. We've got questions about do government and others understand the fundamentals of the energy market? Is this why they don't listen to reports that say we've got a problem coming down the line? Because they actually don't understand what drives energy prices. So my question for all of you is, do we need much higher energy literacy in the population as a whole to deliver what we need to deliver? And if so, how on earth do we go about achieving that? So Antony, I'm going to come to you first on this one. If there's anything that Europe is doing differently from the UK in terms of getting people to understand energy, and what can we learn?
Yeah, yes. My favourite stat on this is from mid last decade that said, on average, people think about their energy bill for 6 minutes a year, which is not surprising. Why do you care about it? You change, it's all automated, you change it every now and again, you get your electricity. Yeah, it doesn't happen. It doesn't affect your life. And I think that is different. I mean, it is now a topic for conversation on the bus, in the street, etc., etc. People talking about energy and the consequences on their lives. So I hope that is a positive thing that we're starting to see, is people thinking about affordability, how can they save energy, etc., etc. All of these things are important. But I guess from a concern about climate change, we wish that it isn't just price driven, that there needs to be wider consideration. But I do think this does open a door to us. I mean, in terms of wider Europe, I guess I come back to my point that I made, is it was really so depressing, I thought, in the spring of this year. Actually, at Chatham House, we had Kwasi Kwarteng speaking at what's called the London Conference, and he gave the keynote address, and it was on energy. And he was asked about energy efficiency, and he just dismissed it and said, it's not for us to do. And he was basically laughing at the French and saying, look, the French are telling people to take showers, not baths, ha, ha, ha. And it was just, I don't know, it reminded me a bit of, and I don't know if this is a correct comparison, but at the beginning of COVID, people looked at Italy in terms of the numbers and basically going, look, the Italians are getting really huge numbers. That's funny for them, isn't it? Not seeing what was coming down the road, and it was just a matter of time. And I felt very much it's the same on this. Is we haven't seized the opportunity, or the government hasn't seized the opportunity, and I hope it changes. And we are seeing in Europe massive public information campaigns that I hope does change literacy, does make people want to engage more, but we cannot assume that they do. I mean, there has to be, in some ways, more defaults, more smart systems that enable people to the right choices to be made for people that can help across the stratosphere in terms of people's economic situations, etc., etc. So it's not just information, it is defaults and smart systems that I think are necessary.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Antony. Mike, is there anything you'd like to add on energy literacy as part of the solution?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think from my perspective, the things, there's a lot of change coming. There's a lot of change that is going to happen in people's lives now. You know, we've had the period of change behind the kind of the supply side, shifting to offshore wind, etc. And we're now in that phase of shifting the vehicles people drive, shifting the way they heat their homes. And, you know, whether do we need it? I mean, it certainly would help a lot if we can get people to understand why that change needs to happen, what sorts of things, what the options are that are going to be available to them, what they can do. And actually, are people willing at the moment? You know, 4 out of 5 households have been looking pretty actively at how they can cut their energy bills. I think it's 98% have been looking to some degree or another. You know, now is an amazing window of opportunity to get in there and link up these crises and get out there and get people to kind of understand what they can do, because people also want to act on climate change. That's really clear in all the polling that you see. So kind of to bring all that together and help people to understand what they can do, you know, while it's still in a space of what you can do rather than what you have to do, what's being forced on you, that's an opportunity to get ahead again and to make this a positive transition that people feel good about, rather than a negative one that they feel is being forced on them and making them do things that they don't want to do. So I think we should be doing that, and now is such a good window to be doing it. It really would be a shame to miss it.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Thanks. Elizabeth, do you want to just briefly come in on this before we go to closing remarks?
To reiterate, you know, people have very clearly shown in polling and in detailed conversations they want to make a difference on climate change. And whereas in the past we might have had, you know, minutes of a year of people thinking about their energy bills, people are very actively thinking about their comfort and the fact that right now they are cold in their homes. So I completely agree on this window of opportunity. But we need to remember that the things which are going to make a difference to people, the fabric of people's homes and how they behave with their energy, is more than what we might have traditionally thought about literacy. Like, I need some information, I'll act on the information. The structures are not there to support people in interpreting advice and information that's out there. We have a model that seems to be working really well in Scotland, and that's advice direct to people that is bespoke to their home and their circumstances. And I think it's that is really going to shift the dial as far as the consumers are concerned, is bespoke, trusted advice about your home and your family.
Excellent. Thank you. Couldn't agree more, Elizabeth. We are almost out of time. I'd like to give each of you an opportunity to give us some final thoughts, but I'd like to frame it this way. We had one comment in the chat that said there was an FT headline last week saying the end of Europe's energy crisis is in sight. Well, so first of all, do you agree? And secondly, bringing us right back to the here and now, if you could see one thing happen next week to help in this winter's crisis, what would it be? So, Juliet, would you like to go first on this one?
Thanks. Great to go first. So is the end of the energy crisis in sight? Obviously, we all hope it is. I think we have to plan for a resilient future where prices are likely to remain volatile, and there's still an enormous job to do to protect households and also industry from energy price spikes in the future. And the permanent solution to this is retrofit, and it is shifting people onto renewable energy. So I think whether the end of this crisis is in sight or not, then there's long-term imperative to do so in any case. And the end of the climate crisis is definitely not in sight. We're facing absolutely record-breaking temperatures this month and last month. So I think there's an imperative to crack on with these solutions, you know, whether prices of gas drop in the next few months or not.
Super.
And the one thing I would ask to do, gosh, big question. Whilst I suppose I'm always a big fan of saying that we can't just throw money at the problem, and I do think we really need to engage in the nuts and bolts and have this kind of ecosystem approach, I do think that the upfront costs of retrofit do remain one of the biggest challenges. So I do think we need to throw more financial firepower behind this challenge in the same way we have done with some of the supply side issues.
Super. Thanks, Juliet. Antony, can I turn to you next?
Is the European energy crisis over? No, unfortunately, I think it's going to get worse next winter. As I said, I think we will have more. It takes a number of years until new infrastructure can be put in place. And so until that is the case, then yeah, we are extremely susceptible to unaffordability of energy from industry and from consumer sort of households. So in terms of what should be done, yeah, I mean, I get, it has to be efficiency. It is on the short term, behavioral change can make a difference for the next 18 months. But in the longer term, yes, it is the retrofitting, the changing of infrastructure, etc. But we need to prioritize demand as much as possible.
Thanks, Antony. Mike, could I turn to you next?
Yeah, thank you. I think in terms of moving forward, the big thing now is that the energy trilemma, you know, affordability, security, sustainability, has been solved, and that the solution is a renewables-based system, efficiency, and extensive electrification. That is undoubtedly the direction now from all of those angles. So that is a big step. That doesn't mean that the crisis is solved. There's a lot still to do, but that is a big step forward. I guess I'm not allowed to say the one thing that I want is all 300 CCC recommendations acted on. That's what I would like, but probably the top of the agenda at the moment for me is that the Energy Advice Service properly gets up and running and is treated with the seriousness that it warrants.
Super, thank you, Mike. Elizabeth.
Well, now I know the advice is there. I have to, so firstly to say I agree. I don't think that the crisis is over or nearly over. And now that I know that Mike's magic wand has brought in the energy advice that we need, for me it really is the short-term need for tomorrow is boots on the ground, energy efficiency install, get that retrofit happening. I love to have the renewables there, but the energy efficiency of the home will mean that homes are ready for more significant interventions and people can be, hopefully they're more ready for next winter. Targeted retrofit for people most in need.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Rob, last words.
Right, so as most of the forward curves for wholesale electricity and gas prices have been adjusted upwards for an extended period of years, which suggests that from that perspective at least, the crisis is not expected to be over soon by most analysts. I think we should expect oscillations though, and I think that any kind of positive news that might happen in the spring, whether it's regards to energy gas supply or the conflict, would be likely to see dramatic reductions in the gas price that might then be followed by increases again. So I think we should expect to see volatile prices. That doesn't mean that the crisis is over. And as I think, you know, Mike's alluded to, and Juliet, the climate crisis is still there, irrespective of what's happening with the current energy price crisis and our concerns about vulnerability. I think the information provision, I don't think energy literacy being improved is necessarily the need, but I think energy advice and energy efficiency in advice. The analogy that I would draw is with, you know, every winter we have a Don't Drink and Drive campaign at Christmas, or we've historically for years had a Wear Your Seatbelt campaign. That doesn't mean that people don't understand how to put their seatbelts on, right? It's just that there is, and we used to have a unit in government that was focused on energy efficiency advice. So there's a whole huge literature around information and nudging and reminding and why that's valuable. Otherwise we wouldn't have adverts, because everybody would just know what products to buy. So I think you need to see it within that context rather than thinking that we can have a wholesale improvement in energy literacy. I mean, internet providers don't expect you to understand how your router works. So I think we need to see that within that context, and anything that we're trying to do on the demand side needs to be made as simple as possible to engage with, and that's very, very clear from the research evidence. I could say lots of other things, but it's 11:30, so I'll stop.
Thanks, Rob. Yes, it is indeed 11:30. We're out of time. First of all, I'd like to say a huge thank you to all our speakers. There's lots of food for thought there. So I hope you've all enjoyed it. I'd like to thank you all for attending and for participating, and apologies for not being able to answer all 58 of your questions. We did our best, and hopefully we covered a lot of them. We are sharing a feedback form. There's a link in the chat, so if you wouldn't mind filling that in for us, that would be fantastic. Thank you very much. And if you enjoyed this and know someone who missed it, do remember that it will be shared. It has been recorded and it will be shared, so tell people to watch it because I think it was very good. There's clearly still a lot to be done, so I'm going to let you go and get on with it. Have a great rest of the day. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all. Thanks, Joanne.
Bye-bye.